Some scholars argue that Isaiah 60 verse 7, which predicts the restoration of animal sacrifices, contradicts the Christian belief in the sacrificial death of Jesus as the ultimate atonement for humanity's sins. According to this Christian perspective, Jesus' sacrifice negates the necessity for the Old Testament sacrifices. What is the basis of the arguments presented by these scholars?
Isaiah 60 verse 7 states, "All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you, the rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you, they shall come up with acceptance on my altar, and I will beautify my glorious house." This verse has prompted debates among scholars, particularly regarding its implications for the Christian belief in Jesus' sacrificial death as the ultimate atonement for humanity's sins. Here's the basis of their argument. 1. Literal interpretation of the prophecy. Some scholars argue that Isaiah 60 verse 7 predicts a literal restoration of Old Testament animal sacrifices. This interpretation suggests a future scenario where temple rituals, including offerings, are reintroduced. For Christians who believe Jesus' death was the ultimate and final atonement for sin, Hebrews 10 verses 10 to 18, this interpretation seems contradictory, as it implies that these sacrifices in Isaiah retain some salvific value. 2. Theological implications. If Isaiah 60 verse 7 indeed prophesies the reinstatement of animal sacrifices, it raises questions about the sufficiency of Jesus' sacrifice. Central to Christian theology is the belief that Jesus' crucifixion fulfilled and replaced the sacrificial system outlined in the Old Testament. Matthew 5, verse 17, John 19, verse 30. Any reintroduction of sacrifices could imply that Jesus' atonement was incomplete, directly challenging key doctrines of salvation and the New Covenant. 3. Symbolic versus literal. Many Christian scholars interpret Isaiah 60, verse 7 symbolically rather than literally. They argue that the reference to sacrifices and altars is metaphorical, symbolizing worship, devotion, and the gathering of nations to God. In this view, the verse does not predict a literal return to Old Testament sacrificial practices, but reflects the restoration and glorification of God's people in a spiritual sense. 4. Eschatological considerations. For Christians, eschatological theology plays a critical role in understanding Isaiah 60, verse 7. Some argue that, if this prophecy is taken literally, it contradicts the belief that Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection were the ultimate and final means of atonement. This creates tension between a literal interpretation of the verse and the Christian doctrine of salvation. 5. Comparative religious perspective, Eid al-Adha. Interestingly, some Islamic scholars view the prophecy of Isaiah 60, verse 7, as aligning more closely with Islamic traditions, particularly the celebration of Eid al-Adha, the Feast of Sacrifice. This festival commemorates Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Ishmael in obedience to God and involves the offering of animals as part of worship. From this perspective, the prophecy of Isaiah 60, verse 7, reflects a continuation of sacrificial practices consistent with Islamic beliefs, contrasting with the Christian claim that Jesus' death replaced all sacrifices. Conclusion. The interpretation of Isaiah 60, verse 7 presents a theological challenge, particularly for Christian doctrines concerning the sufficiency of Jesus' sacrificial death. A literal understanding of the verse raises questions about the necessity and effectiveness of Jesus' crucifixion as the final and complete sacrifice for sin. However, alternative interpretations, such as symbolic readings or eschatological frameworks, allow many Christians to reconcile this passage with their beliefs. Meanwhile, comparative religious perspectives, such as those from Islam, offer alternative understandings that highlight the complexity and depth of this biblical prophecy.